Painting is one of the oldest art forms. When societies began crafting tools and making fire, they were also learning to represent the world in pictures. These pictures were recorded in cave paintings that still exist today. Cave dwellers were the earliest artists. Colored drawings of animals, dating from about 30,000 to 10,000 years ago, have been found on the walls of caves in southern France and in Spain. Many of these drawings are amazingly well preserved because the caves were sealed up for many centuries. Early people drew the wild animals that they saw all around them. Very crude human figures, drawn in lifelike positions, have been found in Africa and eastern Spain. The cave artists filled the cave walls with drawings in rich, bright colors. Some of the most beautiful paintings are in the cave of Altamira, in Spain. One detail shows a wounded buffalo, no longer able to stand, probably the victim of a hunter. The history of painting is a never-ending chain that began with the very first pictures ever made. Each style grows out of the styles that came before it. Every great artist adds to the accomplishments of earlier painters and influences later painters. A painting always describes something. It may describe the artist's impression of a scene or person. It also describes the artist's feelings about the art of painting itself. Diving deeper into understanding different painting styles is truly a fascinating study and will give us an insight into the myriad expressions of art, all over the world. Abstract art is art that does not attempt to represent an accurate depiction of a visual reality but instead use shapes, colors, forms, and gestural marks to achieve its effect. The term can be applied to art that is based on an object, figure or landscape, where forms have been simplified or schematized. It is also applied to art that uses forms, such as geometric shapes or gestural marks, which have no source at all in external visual reality. Academic art is a style of painting, sculpture, and architecture produced under the influence of European academies of art. Specifically, academic art is the art and artists influenced by the standards of the French Academy of Arts, which was practiced under the movements of Neoclassicism and Romanticism, and the art that followed these two movements in the attempt to synthesize both of their styles. The first art academies appeared in Italy at the time of the Renaissance. They were groupings of painters whose aim was to improve the social and professional standing of artists, as well as to provide teaching. Renaissance is an era in the history of European culture that replaced the culture of the Middle Ages and preceded the culture of the new time. Approximate chronological framework of the era 14 to 16 centuries. A distinctive feature of the Renaissance is the secular nature of culture and its anthropocentrism, that is, interest, first of all, to man and his activity. Drawing pictures of traditional religious themes, artists began to use new artistic techniques, building a three-dimensional composition, using the landscape in the background, which allowed them to make the images more realistic, lively. The Renaissance reached its peak, known as the High Renaissance, in the short period from about 1500 to 1530s. Mannerism is a style that emerged in 1530 and lasted until the end of the century. It is named after maniera, an Italian term for style or manner, and refers to a stylized, exaggerated approach to painting and sculpture. As a whole, Mannerist painting tends to be more artificial and less naturalistic than Renaissance painting. This exaggerated idiom is typically associated with attributes such as emotionalism, elongated human figures, strained poses, unusual effects of scale, lighting or perspective, vivid, often garish colors. Baroque is one of the great styles that dominated the architecture and art of European countries from the end of the 16th to the mid-18th centuries. The main characteristics of the Baroque were the scale, the abundance of décor, stormy dynamics, the desire for illusory effects in the organization of the interior space, increasing the size of the premises with the help of mirrors, the height of the halls thanks to the picturesque shades, which have a difficult solution of perspective. All this corresponded to the new picture of the universe, changeable, conflict, where the moribund and the born are in constant confrontation, and a man with his passions, entangled, complex inner world is often dominated by irrational forces. The terms classic or classical came into use in the 17th century to describe the arts and culture of the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. Classicism is generally associated with harmony and restraint, and obedience to recognized standards of form and craftsmanship. Classicism in the painting represents, first of all, the unity of the modern world for the artist with the ancient heritage. In the works of painting, the mind of man is opposed to the forces of nature, and the social to the personal. Classicism, as one of the heirs of antiquity, by itself, attributed to the high genre of paintings that were written on historical and mythological subjects. They are quite clearly traced drama, sacrificing one's personal interests for the common good. Sentimentalism, the direction of Western art of the second half of 18th century, expressing disappointment in a civilization based on the ideals of reason. Sentimentalism proclaims the feeling, solitary thinking, the simplicity of the rural life of the little man. In its specific sense, realism refers to a mid-19th century artistic movement characterized by subjects painted from everyday life in a naturalistic manner. However, the term is also generally used to describe artworks painted in a realistic, almost photographic way. The term realism was coined by the French novelist Champfleury in the 1840s and in art was exemplified in the work of his friend the painter Gustave Courbet. In practice, realist subject matter meant scenes of peasant and working class life, the life of the city streets, cafes and popular entertainments. Symbolism began as a literary movement in France in the 1880s during a period of enormous change and upheaval in Europe. Symbolist art shifted the emphasis from the direct representation of nature to the world of the imagination. Instead of describing something with precise, realistic detail or stating facts, they used personal metaphors and symbols, evoking a meaning or feeling instead. Impressionism developed in France in the 19th century and is based on the practice of painting out of doors and spontaneously, on the spot rather than in a studio from sketches. Main Impressionist subjects were landscapes and scenes of everyday life. Impressionism was developed by Claude Monet and other Paris-based artists from the early 1860s. Instead of painting in a studio, the Impressionists found that they could capture the momentary and transient effects of sunlight by working quickly, in front of their subjects, in the open air, rather than in a studio. One of the most interesting kinds of painting is Pointillism. This is a kind of artistic technique to draw separate strokes of various shapes. The author of this method is considered the French painter Georges-Pierre Seurat. Pointillism involved the application of paint in carefully placed dots of pure, unmixed color. Postimpressionism, artistic direction, the conventional collective designation of a heterogeneous set of basic directions in European painting, a term adopted in art history for the designation of development of French art. the artists of this direction refused to depict only a visible reality or momentary impression and sought to depict its fundamental, regular elements, long-term states of the surrounding world, essential states of life, while at the same time resorting to decorative stylization. Outstanding representatives of post-impressionism in painting include Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, and Paul Cézanne. Modernism refers to a global movement in society and culture that from the early decades of the 20th century sought a new alignment with the experience and values of modern industrial life. Building on late 19th century precedents, artists around the world used new imagery, materials, and techniques to create artworks that they felt better reflected the realities and hopes of modern societies. Primitivism is a mode of aesthetic idealization that either emulates or aspires to recreate primitive experience. In Western art, primitivism typically has borrowed from non-Western or prehistoric people perceived to be primitive. Borrowings from primitive art has been important to the development of modern art. The utopian end toward which primitivists aspire usually lies in a national state of nature in which their ancestors existed, or in the supposed natural condition of the peoples that live beyond civilization. Cubism was a revolutionary new approach to representing reality invented in around 1907–08 by artists Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. They brought different views of subjects, usually objects or figures, together in the same picture, resulting in paintings that appear fragmented and abstract. By breaking objects and figures down into distinct areas, or planes, the artists aim to show different viewpoints at the same time and within the same space, and so suggest their three-dimensional form. Surrealism is a cultural movement that began in the early 1920s and is best known for its visual artworks and writings. Artists painted unnerving, illogical scenes with photographic precision, created strange creatures from everyday objects and developed painting techniques that allowed the unconscious to express itself. Its aim was to resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, a super-reality. Surrealism developed out of the Dada activities during World War I, and the most important center of the movement was Paris. From the 1920s onward, the movement spread around the globe, eventually affecting the visual arts, literature, film, and music of many countries and languages, as well as political thought and practice, philosophy, and social theory. Futurism was an Italian art movement of the early 20th century that aimed to capture in art the dynamism and energy of the modern world. The Futurists sought to sweep away traditional artistic notions and replace them with an energetic celebration of the machine age. The focus was placed on creating a unique and dynamic vision of the future, and artists incorporated portrayals of urban landscapes as well as new technologies such as trains, cars, and airplanes into their depictions. Expressionism is a modernist movement, initially in poetry and painting, originating in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. Its typical trait is to present the world solely from a subjective perspective, distorting it radically for emotional effect in order to evoke moods or ideas. Expressionist artists have sought to express the meaning of emotional experience rather than physical reality. Expressionism refers to art in which the image of reality is distorted in order to make it expressive of the artist's inner feelings or ideas. Pop art is an art movement that emerged in the United Kingdom and the United States during the mid to late 1950s. The movement presented a challenge to traditions of fine art by including imagery from popular and mass cultures, such as advertising, comic books, and mundane cultural objects. One of its aims is to use images of popular as opposed to elitist culture in art, emphasizing the banal or kitschy elements of any culture, most often through the use of irony. Dada was an art movement formed during the First World War in Zurich in negative reaction to the horrors and folly of the war. The art, poetry, and performance produced by Dada artists are often satirical and nonsensical in nature. Minimalism is an extreme form of abstract art developed in the USA in the 1960s and typified by artworks composed of simple geometric shapes based on the square and the rectangle. Minimalism or minimalist art can be seen as extending the abstract idea that art should have its own reality and not be an imitation of some other thing. We usually think of art as representing an aspect of the real world, a landscape, a person, or reflecting an experience such as an emotion or feeling. With minimalism, no attempt is made to represent an outside reality. The artist wants the viewer to respond only to what is in front of them. Conceptual art, sometimes simply called conceptualism, is art in which the concepts or ideas involved in the work take precedence over traditional aesthetic, technical, and material concerns. It emerged as an art movement in the 1960s, and the term usually refers to art made from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. Some works of conceptual art, sometimes called installations, may be constructed by anyone simply by following a set of written instructions. Neoclassicism was a particularly pure form of classicism that emerged from about 1750. Neoclassicism always refers to the art produced later but inspired by antiquity. An artistic style as known as neoclassicism was the predominant movement in European art and architecture during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It reflected a desire to rekindle the spirit and forms of classical art from ancient Greece and Rome, whose principles of order and reason were entirely in keeping with the European Age of Enlightenment. Neoclassical works, paintings and sculptures were serious, unemotional, and sternly heroic. Photorealism is a genre of art that encompasses painting, drawing and other graphic media, in which an artist studies a photograph and then attempts to reproduce the image as realistically as possible in another medium. Although the term can be used broadly to describe artworks in many different media, it is also used to refer specifically to a group of paintings and painters of the American art movement that began in the late 1960s and early 1970s.